I am Jim Collison, and this is Gallup's Call to Coach, recorded on June 23rd, 2023. Call to Coach is a resource for those who want to help others discover and use their strengths. We have Gallup experts and independent strengths coaches share tactics, insights, and strategies to help coaches maximize the talent of individuals, teams, and organizations around the world. If you're listening live, you don't see the chat room. There's a link to it right above me there. Click on that. Join us in the chat. If you have questions after the fact, or if you're listening to this in the recorded version, you can always send us an email, coaching@gallup.com. Don't forget to subscribe to Call to Coach on your favorite podcast app or right down there on YouTube so you never miss an episode. Susie Tomenchok is my guest today. She's an entrepreneur, accomplished author, and highly sought after executive coach, dedicated to empowering her clients to unleash their inner negotiators. I love that sentence. With a career spanning over 20 years in the telecommunications industry, Susie's expertise and experience are unparalleled. She has been a Gallup-Certified Strengths Coach since 2017. And Susie, always great to be with you. Welcome to Call to Coach.
Oh, I'm thrilled to be here, Jim. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, good to have you. And I'm always excited when I get a guest that has a really good microphone. So thank you.
Thanks to you.
Thanks.
I have to say.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thanks for doing that. Let's get to know you a little bit. Give us your elevator speech when you meet somebody for the first time. What do you tell them about yourself?
Yeah. I am like right in the space I'm supposed to be now, but the journey to get me here, I didn't like have a plan or a map, but I was a corporate executive and was really brought to the table to negotiate deals, big deals, expensive deals, because they involve satellites and connectivity and all this stuff. So by default, I was in rooms with really high up people. And I think just that experience of just kind of like having to be on and learning the nuances of just building relationships is all it's about. I'm a mom of 3 who are now in their 20s, and also just seeing how important negotiation, just to go there right away, is in our everyday. So my journey was one of deep experience because I just kind of would always throw myself into what I was doing, learn as much as I could, really get to know people, has brought me to be where I am today. And so I know that wasn't like a very succinct answer, but
It's great.
kind of my path.
It's your answer. And I love the fact that you're able to kind of say, I didn't necessarily plan this path.
No.
Listen, I think we're all in a similar boat. We're negotiating our way through life, trying to figure
Yeah.
things out. I didn't know. I didn't think, 15, 20 years ago, I'd be doing this right now, yet we're here today. We're talking about negotiations or negotiating. And I think for some people, that's a very scary word. For others, it's a dirty word. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, they think of buying a car and having to negotiate. Right. That's probably, at least for in the United States, that's probably the most the difficult thing, or house buying too. Right. This idea of negotiating. Why at the very top level? Why is that so? Why do we see that as such a difficult process? Why are people so afraid of that? What do you think?
Yeah, I think we all have a different relationship with that word. And we've been taught that it's really important. Like there is something about negotiation that everybody understands it's an important skill, but we also tend to think of it for this occasion, this time. And I'll watch a YouTube video before then I go, or I'll do something to get myself ready, because this high stakes situation that the world has labeled as high stakes is only occasionally. And it's all around manipulation. I think car is the best one. Like we can all get a visualization of who we believe that car salesperson is. And what's really interesting about that scenario, I'm glad you brought it up, is because that's probably one of the only situations where in a negotiation, we don't have a long-term relationship with that person. It doesn't really matter, but we just feel had by them. And you know what? I'll tell you, I just recently bought a car. And I was like, so ready, I knew all my facts. I'm like, I feel like sometimes if I say I'm a negotiation guru, I better, show my chops wherever I go. So I had high expectations for myself. And then I get to so I did a really good job. I felt like I reasoned very well, figured out, the best deal I could get. And then I went to the finance guy and I was like, whew. And I even said to the finance guy, thinking he's my buddy,
Yeah.
did I get a good deal? Did I do this well? And then he sells me the warranty and I totally fell for it. Hook, line, and sinker. Like I put my guard down. And it's so interesting just to
Yeah.
think about those situations and then we relax or we put our guard down. But if we don't look at it like this situation, because it tenses us up and not enables us to think clearly.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we think, well, and let me say this first before I get to there. You and I come from a very unique U.S. culture where negotiations,
Mhm.
where we don't negotiate for things generally. You go to
Completely.
Walmart, you just buy it. It's the price, right?
Yeah.
And there might be a clearance area or it might be on sale, right? That's as close as we get in our day to day. Around the world, actually, that's an exception. A
Yeah.
lot of times, negotiating is a part of everything in a lot of different cultures, and so we come at it uniquely from, I think, Americans, and maybe other cultures that don't have that built in come at it from that unique perspective. But really, when we think about negotiating, every day we negotiate, and you're going to use this term high stakes.
Mhm.
We negotiate or we have to work our way through decisions, influencing people to move them in directions. Why, from a leadership perspective, why is that such a critical role for leaders to understand? And I think from a strengths perspective, we want to think our strengths probably influence the way we
Mhm.
negotiate or influence, right? I want to kind of
Absolutely.
put those. Is it okay if I put those two words
Yeah.
together? Can I put influence and negotiate kind of together on this? Why is that important for leaders, do you think?
Well, I think everybody would agree that the skill of negotiation is a critical skill for executives and for leaders, like sometime. But when you think about it as an umbrella skill set, it is so applicable to every day. Meaning, when you're thoughtful, the best negotiators consider the interests of the other party. And just going into a meeting, taking 30 seconds. I went to a Harvard leadership and negotiation course a few months ago, and they said when they do simulations and they tell one group to just for 30 seconds consider the interests of the other party before they go in, that group has measurably better results than the other just by simply taking 30 seconds.
Hmm.
And so we were so fast in our everyday that we go from meeting to meeting and conversation to conversation. And if we would just take a pause and kind of be thoughtful about our approach, to think about the interest of the other party, how do we want frame our ask? How do we
Mm,
anchor our ideas? How do we practice silence?
mm,
And talk about coaching and strengths. That is such a critical piece to being a really good coach. But as leaders, those are things that are really difficult to do in practice.
mm,
So when we get really intentional about using these things that they use in a negotiation just as best practices, it makes us better humans because it makes us show up. As coaches know, asking open-ended questions and listening and understanding kind of the other party and how they're moving through their understanding of what's
mhm,
going on. Those are keys to great negotiators. So if you're a good
mm,
coach, you're a great negotiator.
hmm. Let's talk a little bit about you and your top 5. We didn't mention those up front, but let's do that now. Give us your top 5, and then I'm kinda interested as you think about your own themes, how do those power? Because I think our negotiation skills are probably powered by our themes, right,
Mhm.
individually. So can you do that, your top 5, and then how you power your negotiations?
Yeah. So you're gonna know that I'm a good like I say these and I'm like, oh my gosh, people are gonna go, oh, no wonder. Adaptability, relator, self-assurance, woo, and futuristic.
Mm,
And I look back on my journey like we all do, and I can see how I naturally opted in. They didn't have anybody else to put in the negotiation table, but I had these relationship skills that were on fire. You think about my adaptability and just being like in the here and now and being really thoughtful about what's going on, getting my relator, my woo, my self assurance. Sure, if I can do this, let's figure out a path
mm,
to success.
mhm.
I can see kind of my growth through those. And they make me really excited because I'm like, yeah, this is what I was meant to do. It makes a lot of sense. And so I think that my talents made me believe before I had the skill that I could try and do, and I'd find the path to the end. And I see somebody in chat said, "Has your adaptability got in your way?" And it absolutely has as well. Is how I do fight against my adaptability. It's such a great because I will get I for me, the big thing is when you're in a negotiation, you want to be as objective as you can. So the way you get that is you have to plan what you want. We have to be clear about your outcomes, and you have to think about what is that going to feel like being in my body as I go through this, because I get nervous. I don't want to take advantage of people. There's all these things and emotions and triggers that can get in our way. And my adaptability can be like, oh, I see your point. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't really need that. I can definitely work
Mhm.
against. But so for me, I have to have a plan, and I have to say, are the three things I'm going to get. And if I don't get these three things, then, it's a walk away. Or
Mhm.
I have to make that line in the sand for my adaptability, or else I won't get the end that I wanted to.
Yeah, or it may be a case for a renegotiation, right? A
Mhm,
rediscussion of like, okay, well, okay, 2 out of 3, but I'm gonna need some consensus for you, or I'm gonna need some additional things from you on this. It's interesting. I think we often think you use that word high stakes, or I use that word high stakes a little bit earlier, but even some of the smallest tasks that we do day to day. So I want to use you coming on Call to Coach as an example, because I don't make it easy for folks to be on the program. Like,
no.
I intentionally I shouldn't be, I'm giving away my negotiation secrets here. Okay, this is cone of silence for you, the guys listening live, but I intentionally put some barriers in place because I don't want it to, I want people to really want to do it, right? I don't want, oftentimes folks will say, I want to do it, and then I can't get anything from them. And so that, working with them, you and I spent some time kind of negotiating, like, okay, Susie, tell me, like, bring it. What if you were going to be on the program, what would you bring? And so it was your responsibility to come back to me and give
Mhm,
like, here's the value I'm going to bring. Here's what we're thinking about. So we didn't trade anything in this
mhm,
transaction. We didn't sign a multi-million dollar contract. And yet the
mhm,
process of getting to this point where we're today was a negotiation, right?
mhm.
Is there for people who are struggling, thinking through this, like, man, I am terrible at negotiating. What kind of advice do you give them out of the chute? What could they be thinking about? What kind of some things, maybe based on their top five, or all 34 if they have access to that? What kind of framework or what kind of things could they be using to start thinking about this and reframing it from being, oh, I'm terrible at it, I don't want to do this, to, no, I need to do some of these things. How can I do it better?
That was a big question.
Yeah, sorry.
No, no, no. I have so many things so many angles to go. So let's talk a little bit about this high stakes situation. So,
Yeah.
what is high stakes? We tend to think that people label high stakes situations for us. Those occasions that come up occasionally when you're negotiating a big deal, when you're doing these things that are high stakes that society tells us what they are. But truly, high stakes is when it's meaningful to you, when it's something, and it could be something you're avoiding. And so high stakes can really I one tip is, when you go into any conversation, let's just take going to a movie with your partner. Now, if you just want to spend time with them and you don't really have a movie that you really want to see, low stakes for you, whatever they want. But as soon as it's the first, it's a movie that you've been waiting to see, it's something that you wanna be the first of so that you can talk about it with your friends. All of a sudden, the stakes for you to convince the partner to go see the movie you wanna see has shifted a little bit, because that's important to you. Now, just having that awareness around what is something I want? How important is this to me? Allows you to get really clear about moving through that conversation. And absolutely thinking about your strengths and how to adapt them in the right way and know when to turn them down.
Mm-hmm.
My adaptability, making those decisions when it isn't that important to me, drives people crazy because, sure, if you don't want to go a movie, even though we've planned that for 2 weeks, I'm fine with
Mm-hmm.
going to eat or do something instead. So it's just like the way in every situation we have to turn and be aware of our strengths and how they're working for that condition that we're moving into, that situation. It's the same thing with a negotiation to consider how will my adaptability and my woo and relator work for me in the situation to build that trust, build that bond, not to make that person feel like they're not being manipulated. Like you
Mm-hmm.
said when you were explaining all that, you said, I don't want people to think that this is a negotiation, but now I'm giving you all my cards. Well, that's kind of the thing. That's the air of it. If in order to signal reciprocity and get people to think creatively, you want to show them that here's my interest too. Let's
Mm-hmm.
talk about this. Let's exchange this. What's important to you?
What I hear you saying is getting to know the other person's when we're doing this, whatever that is, getting to know the other person's best interest. Like,
Mhm.
okay, what's in this for you? And here's what I need out of the transaction. Here's what I
Mhm.
need. Sometimes we don't need a lot. Sometimes we do need a lot out of it. And then thinking through this idea of how do we both win in this,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And would you actually going into that, would you phrase it that way? In other words, having a conversation to say, "Can you just tell me, like, let's talk about how do I help you in this?
Mhm.
How do we both?" Is that a I think for some people, they feel like they're giving away the store if they do that, but is that a way to approach this?
Yeah. Absolutely, because you want people like, how great is that? That's why I say it makes us better humans because when you walk into a situation and say, you know what, this is something that's really important to me.
Mhm,
And this is a situation that I've been thinking about for a while because I've actually been avoiding having this conversation because the outcome I know is important to you and to me. And I've been thinking about what is really important to Jim? So let's take your example. You want to make sure that when you have a high standard for this podcast and the
mhm,
people that are on here, and you want to have consistency. So you said to me, "Hey, just so you know, there's a high bar. You have to follow these things. This is the standard." And so you set my expectations. You told me what I had to deliver. And because you gave me that clarity, I wanted so badly to reach to those
mm,
expectations. And you
mhm,
weren't hidden about it.
mhm,
If you were hidden about it and you asked me all these questions, I'm like, oh my gosh, like when is this going to end?
mhm,
But when you
mhm,
frame it, it really does open up. The game is that maybe sometimes you get what you want and it's not the win-win and win-lose is like kind of outdated. Do you know that negotiation came in the days of it started in legal, obviously, back in the
sure,
50s
sure,
and
yeah,
and then it got to the business school and now it is about how do you really think about the win and the win.
mhm,
And sometimes you have to consider your best interests over others and there might be information that you don't tell because you're framing it to help them understand
mhm,
your perspective
mhm.
and not to take advantage of.
How important do you think in a team setting where we have little negotiations happening all the time because we've got to get tasks
Mhm.
done? I've got to get there's certain things, for me, I think about just the two processes and both people that are involved in this negotiation are listening to this in the future. Both Roy, who does the video edits, and Mark, who does the audio transcriptions and writes all this stuff for me. They're in their own form, they're listening right now in the future, which is kind of weird to think about that. But as an influencer, I have to negotiate with them on timelines and deadlines constantly. How important is it then for me knowing the way they approach this from their own strengths? And are there some questions as I'm learning that? Are there some questions I could be asking them as we think about coaches helping people negotiate? What kind of questions could I use to help me understand their negotiation framework, the way they see this, so that we work better together? Any questions come to mind that would help me with that?
Yeah. So the key, just like finding a house, it's location, location, location. In negotiation, it's prepare, prepare, prepare. So when you sit back and think about your strengths and you anticipate what your needs are, how, like I said before, but as you walk through this, how will you aim those strengths in a way that's going to work best for you? Kind of going through that journey for you so that you can identify when one might get in your way or which one will help you move through the journey. Because a negotiation and any situation or any relationship that you have, you're right, it goes through this ebbs and flows. Like the negotiation starts, a traditional negotiation starts with the first conversation. It's not a one and done. It's all evolving. So all the things you say can be pieces that you tie back in, and we forget that. And so when you think, so some of the questions that I would ask about moving in, especially as a leader or as you're coaching somebody, is what is this is my end. This is where I'm clear, that you have to get really clear first. What is important to them, or what questions are they going to have?
Mm.
What if I am working with somebody that has a lot of strategic thinking themes and I'm going to approach them? Maybe I do want to say, hey, listen, and send an email with an outline of some of the things I've been thinking. And here's this is where I want to get in our meeting. I want to be really clear on this. So I just wanted to give you, these are the 3 points that I want to talk about and explore. And so that might meet their needs. So yes, you're kind of showing your cards a little bit, but you're also saying, I see you. I understand you. I understand what might be important to you. And then that way, when they get to the table or you're having the conversation with them, they already feel like you've thought about their interests and you're anticipating what their needs are so you can fulfill them in the best way.
Yeah. I think that comes down to these teamwork exercises that we do. I think sometimes we think they're just about understanding each other, but we've also got this, we're constantly influencing one another in team roles, right? When we come, we're always negotiating, I guess is what I'm
Mhm.
saying, and the
Yeah.
things that we're doing. Just every day I have these conversations with these two gentlemen that I work with, and it's a negotiation. I actually need you to get this done. What can I do to help you to make it better for you so that we can get these I can get these, because they have pressures on their own, right? They have
Mhm.
other it's not like I'm their only customer. And so they've got pressures of their own. So for me, I think understanding not only what's in it for them, but how they approach it from their top 5 perspective,
Mhm.
right? How do they operate in that, and how does that work for them? A couple questions from the chat room I want to get to so we don't get too far away from them. Yuri says, "What do you do for avoiding your self-assurance? Well, it seems like that may come across as arrogance or over intensity in your negotiations. How have you taken that theme and dialed it in a way that works best for you?"
That's a great question. I remember one person, because I was the negotiator for some of our deals. I remember this gentleman said to me, "Can we just pretend I went back and forth with you a bunch of times and that I got you?" Basically, he goes, "I know you're a really great negotiator, but I don't want to go through the process with you because it makes me really nervous." I give him a lot of props for saying that, and I was just kind of like in my head going, I don't know where you got that from. It's not like I have a sign on me that says, pro, or I have a medal. So that was kind of my first kind of awareness around how am I showing up in a way that does communicate this steadfast confidence in that will just take advantage of you, maybe. I didn't want it to feel that way. So I lean on my other relationship themes to really dial me down when I'm sitting in front of somebody that doesn't doesn't have that same intensity. I have to be really, really intentional about how do I do that. And so for me, it's adding space. Silence is a great way to illustrate that you're listening and you understand. And so it's slowing down and being really aware of that cadence, that pacing, if you will, of a negotiation. And so self-assurance can be really bold and let's get this done. So I've really had to be thoughtful about the other person and what their needs are so that it doesn't feel overwhelming to them
Mhm.
and meet them
Yeah.
where they are.
Yeah. And I don't think it's always as easy as just knowing what to do in the moment all the time. I think you have to gauge because there's certain
Mhm,
situations as leaders where we just have to move forward. It's like,
mhm.
sorry, like
Absolutely.
this has to happen. You
Mhm,
have to complete this training or you can't work here. Like it has to be done. And there's those moments where we have to negotiate through s- convincing them like, hey, it's in your best interest and there's not a lot I can give you for this.
yeah,
It's you just got to get it done. And then there's moments where we can pull back and say, "Hey, this will work better if we do it all in this way, and get it, and work together to get it done." I think Catherine makes a nice comment. She says this makes me think about asking IP questions, right? Capital I, capital P for audio folks, asking them what's important to them, and asking what their pain points are,
mm,
right? The I and the P, especially helpful in job interviews and negotiating. I think back to your original point when we're in this process and we say, "How do I make your life better with this?"
mhm,
is a different way in approaching it and saying, "Look, I have needs." We see this a lot now in retail. When people complain about whatever, they didn't get good service or they didn't like what they got or it didn't work, they come in saying me, I didn't like it, I as opposed to saying, hey, I have a problem with this, but how do I help you? What can I do to help you help me
yeah,
fix this? Right? Is that it? Do you hear a difference in that? Does that make any sense? Am
yeah.
I saying anything?
Oh, I think that's exactly right, and you get worn down too, like, though this is a human interaction, and they say, like, you should go back and forth maybe 3 times, and then the other person kind of gets tired of it, like, "Yes, can you negotiate everything? Yes, but you're gonna ruin relationships along the way." I think about what you said. I went to Egypt, the end of last year, and they negotiate everything, and I got to the point that I saw something I wanted at the shop, but I didn't wanna negotiate. I just wanted to buy it,
Mhm.
and so, for as an American, it can feel overwhelming that everything is negotiable,
Yeah.
and so you need to push and understand the condition, so that you know when that's enough. You can't just go in blazing with everything and just use these best practices. You have to be thoughtful about how much to push that other person
Mhm.
and when to kind of pull back. And to answer your question about the best question when you were talking, the best of me. You get
Mm.
the best of me, and when you think about how can I show up in this situation and get the best of me? And that's a great question to ask somebody else too. And I think that's just such a brilliant question.
Yeah, it kind of makes me think we need to have like some team building exercise with people we're negotiating with
Mhm.
before we go. Like, hey, look, just trust me, this is going to be great, but let's get to know each other a little
Yeah.
bit. And this is the hard part, right? We always think we're going to be the one, and I think this is the fear, is we're always going to be the one taken advantage of,
Yep.
right? If I open up too early, if I give it all away, I'm going to be taken advantage of. In negotiate, how do I get past that, Susie? How do I get past that fear? Are there any techniques to think, or do I just have to trust and move forward? But how do I get past that fear of being taken advantage of?
Yeah, I think we need to normalize this idea of negotiation more often and talk about it being something that is just this interaction. And when we understand that our intention is not to manipulate and to be really open, that's when we need to adjust that. And if somebody is being manipulative to you and you see that, I think you call it out
Mm,
and you say hey, that's not my game. I really feel like am I getting this? I feel like this is like you had said this, but now that doesn't seem to be the reality of the situation and calling that out. But I think you need to try it and be a part of it and understand that when you are open to it and you don't think of it in a negative way, you can use it as a tool instead of a weapon. But you don't know that that's the thing about manipulation, right? We don't ever really know. It's like having this, I call it it's probably a woo hangover too. When I go to a party or something, I haven't met everybody. I have a woo hangover. But you also have this negotiation hangover. And if you're not clear about what you want, you're not when you are clear, then when you get to the end, then you're satisfied with what you want. If you spend time thinking, could I have gotten more money? Could I have done this differently? Those are things to think about, and from your perspective, what could I have done better? But when you dwell in what could have been, because and you wonder if that they manipulated me, or they could have
Mhm.
they did something differently. I don't know that that's time well spent to do that, but so you need to shift that thinking, and it's all about you, because you know who our worst negotiator against us is ourselves.
Yeah.
And
Why
negotiating with
why do you think
ourselves
that
is,
is? Why do you think that is? Why do we is it the doubt? Is it doubt that we struggle with? Of we use words like imposter syndrome
yeah,
in these situations, like, oh no, I know I don't have everything it takes to be able, you think about getting a job, and you go in for the interview and you're like, I don't know if you, I don't even know why you're interviewing me because I don't have anything
yeah,
to, right. We're our,
totally.
we take ourselves out of the running before we've even gone in, right? Is it that self-doubt that
Yeah,
drives this effectiveness in negotiating? Can you talk a little bit about that?
yeah. It is, and it's very nuanced and subtle.
Mhm.
It is. It's that voice that they say psychologically, if you can talk to yourself in third person, then it's almost like you're talking to your best friend, so that you can say, when I have self-doubt about, should I be on this podcast? Do I have the
Mhm.
expertise to be on
Mhm.
this podcast?
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
say, okay, Susie, do you, when I talk to myself like that, then the evidence that you need can kind of bubble up for you so you can see it. But I believe it is that insecurity that we see ourselves in our own skin,
Mhm.
and we have this self-doubt. I listened to Billy Joel the other day, and he did like kind of unplugged, and he was talking about how they were talking about, how do you get ready to get on the stage? And he said, I just walk from my dressing room to the stage, like he just does it. But then he goes, but sometimes I get up on the stage and I'm like, What are all these people doing here?"
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know why it took Billy Joel to say that to me. Don't Well, not to me, but
Yeah.
I heard it.
He did say it to you.
He
You were
said to
listening.
me
Yeah.
that Billy Joel has those same feelings, those
Yeah.
same self-doubts in his head that I do. And so having that awareness of when that comes in, like, oh, this really isn't the right time to do this. That person is not they're not in a very good mood. We
Mhm.
tend to put these things off. And it could be as simple as, I have a really good friend who is a very well respected executive. And she said, oh, they're asking me to speak for this women's group. And I think, why me? My story's not important. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's crazy that and so I had to talk her off the ledge. And then the very next day, somebody asked me basically the same. And I was like, why me? And I think it's so
Mhm.
interesting how we
Mhm.
just don't, we have to be aware of that so that we don't get in our own way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're afraid of failing, right? And that, I think that at the core is like,
Yeah.
I'm afraid I'm going to get up there. And when I was 19, I did an event, a public event, an MC event, and it was a disaster. It was just and it set me back probably 5 years on
Yeah.
my public speaking, because I proved to myself at that point that I wanted to do it. I knew I could do it. I didn't know my top five in those days. It was like in the 80s. And so I didn't know it then, but that failure so impacted me for so many years. And I kind of at that point needed a coach to come through and say, hey, look, okay, what went wrong? And I think as we think about negotiation skills, I think this fits in, right? Fits in very well. What went wrong? Okay, so how do we fix that, or how do we set this up differently the next time?
Mhm.
Your expectations so it can succeed. This is that
Mhm.
self-negotiation, like, okay, well, I can't do all of that, but what can I do
Mhm.
that I know based on who I am I can be successful with? As you that's a question like a coach could use. They'll say, "Yeah, I can't do that because I failed." Okay, well, what can you do?
Mhm.
That's a question. Are there other questions, like, as you're helping people be better negotiators, as you're helping leaders, and not just negotiating from the sense I wanna get away from the buying and selling
Yeah.
negotiating. It's just that's a very small part of negotiations. We have to negotiate every day in the workplace. We have to negotiate work to be done. I use the example of Roy and Mark in my situation. I don't manage them directly. I have to influence them in ways, right, to get things done. Are there other questions I could be asking myself, or as a coach could be asking others, that help get to that point of how do I get better at this area of influence or moving people in those directions? What do you think there are? Are there other questions coaches could deploy?
Yeah, influence is really important within an organization, and all leaders should have kind of awareness around their influence. And so, looking at the evidence that they have influence, are they invited to important meetings? Are they asked uh, questions to solve things? How are other people perceiving them? What are those blind spots, those perceptions of them, and how does it feel to be somebody around them? And so asking the question of those self-awareness and how they are within the organization, I think it's also really a great exercise to look at who does hold influence within that organization, because that culture, that social system, those politics really are unique to that organization. And so when you see who holds influence, that can help you have a path to how do you gain that.
Mm.
And really, influence is all about um, being say what you what you're do what you say you're going to do. You have trusted relationships with people. You advocate for people. Advocate to me is you raise your hand, whether it's for you or for others, and you say, "How? Why not me?"
Mhm.
And you notice the things around us. That's what I think is kind of the missing piece for me. I feel like when people understand that negotiation is a tool, it illuminates this other dimension of what's possible. And sometimes we miss things because we are in our head, because we don't assume, we don't ask the question, wow, instead of saying what I that person always gets these things and you get kind of angry about it, ask a curious question like, how did they get that how did they get a coach? How did they get that opportunity? Well, maybe they asked. And
Mhm.
instead, we just opt ourselves out, or we
Yeah.
don't see these opportunities around me. When you're not clear where you're going professionally, I think another thing is so many professionals look at themselves in their role. And as you coach people, you look at they're defining themselves as their role. Well, they have an obligation. What else do they want to develop as a professional in their entire journey? Well, when you're really clear on that, those opportunities when you're in this is so outdated, elevator with a senior executive, you might say, "Hey, just so you know, I'm really interested in doing this."
Yeah.
And you spark these ideas to places so that you not only opt yourself in, but other people will see you, because influence is about being seen in a positive way so that you can be influential to help get through barriers or boundaries for your team, but also to be seen and create opportunities for yourself and your team.
We often, with leaders and managers, we often say for those you're leading or managing in conversations, what you say about their professional development or their performance should never be a surprise, right? You
Mhm.
should never shock them with it. I think sometimes too in negotiating, especially in a team setting or in a group setting where, again, beyond the car sale or
Yeah.
negotiating the price of something, we surprise folks all of a sudden and say, "Well, I've wanted this the whole time, but nobody would ever," and you've never voiced it, right?
Right.
How important is consistency in this area of influence when we think about negotiating? of having a consistent message of how important is that consistency, the small c, not the strengths of consistency, but the consistency of message in this? What do you think about that?
Gosh, I think that's so important because we believe everybody lives in here. It's almost like they can read what's important to us, but they don't. They don't. Even somebody that is responsible for our development does not always consider our needs first. And so being thoughtful about it, but how are you seeding, anchoring those ideas? How are you reminding people? How are you framing, hey, you can do it in a really positive way. Hey, I'm really excited that my team did a great job on this project. And I will, I'm signaling, I'm anchoring. I'm gonna, in 3 months come back and talk to you about some additional things that I want the team to get. And so I want to make sure that in this moment in time, we recognize and celebrate this. But this is such a great contribution to the overall organization. Just this project helped elevate or drive more revenue or motivate and drive higher engagement for our teams. And so being able to make those connections for people, we think they are, but having that doesn't have to feel like it's self promotion. It's all how you frame things to people and help them see you. And I think it's our responsibility as professionals to figure out in our own voice, in our own way, how do we do that? Because when we advocate for ourselves and our team and we show and teach those best practices to others, and it's really understanding your value and being confident. When you understand your value, everybody knows people love to hear and listen to people that have high confidence because we learn from them. And so when we live in that place of having confidence in who we are, then we're more available to voice that in a positive way. And it makes other people feel that and understand that. And really, when we think about it, we're selling our value. And that value is a value to the other person.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's the win-win.
I think about certified coaches and coaches listening to this podcast, and their question, from a negotiation standpoint, is how do I sell my services as a coach to people, and how do I, because that's a negotiation, right?
Yeah.
We often spend time, with our coaches and coaching methodology of in that very first coaching conversation, asking, what do you want to get out of this time that we're together, right? What if we moved that question up to as we're before we even start coaching with them, to understand, like, I think from what I'm learning from
Mhm.
you, that could be a question we could use in the negotiation front part of it, to say, hey, tell me what you want to, what would you want to get out of this thing before we even talk about coaching? What are we trying to do here? Like,
Yeah.
what do you need help with? How can I help you? How can I help you in what I know? Because you may get an answer you don't have or you may get a question you don't have an answer to, and are you in the best spot to help influence them if you don't have an answer to their question? Right? I don't know. That
Yes.
just came to me. I asked the chat room, what questions do they use to help influence for those that they coach? Justin says, I like to explore how someone has connected with the person that they're trying to influence, how well they know them in and out of the work topics. Kind of a little bit about what I just said there.
Mhm.
Lisa says, I asked them how they've influenced in the past. I think this is a great question. Where have you been successful in the past, right? How has that worked out for you?
Love that.
Maybe even tying that
Mhm.
to it, and maybe that's the anchoring that you're talking about a little bit, right?
Mhm.
Of that. Ken says, what is it that we both want? And I think this reinforces the point. And what is it that we both don't want? How
Yeah.
important is it to work out the to get the stuff we don't need out of the way when we're doing this? How important
Yeah.
is that, Susie?
Well, you definitely have to be aware of it, especially for you, right? To be able to, one best practice I like people to think about is what are all the pieces of leverage that are at play? Positive,
Mm,
negative, power. It can be hierarchy. It could be confidence. It could be the deal points that you want to talk about, the interests of the other party. all of the aspects, like go and brainstorm like everything, and then prioritize and frame exactly like you have all of this work that you've done and you identify everything, and that's the good and the bad. And then you frame exactly what's important to you and the story that you want to tell the other person. And while some of those things might hang outside of that, meaning some of the things that the other person doesn't want to happen, and maybe it doesn't come up in conversation, but if it does, then you've anticipated that and you've thought about it and said, oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, I thought about that too. And that's why that won't work for me. Or that's why, this is the plan I had for that. It just kind of illustrates that. But taking that time to really uncover and understand gives you a lot of agility in the moment because you've kind of pre-thought that all through. And it's not like you're here's a good example. I had a friend of mine who was a very top executive, and his CEO boss came to him and they were promoting him, and a lot of money, everything he ever wanted. But they were paying the other guy more money than they were offering him, and they didn't respect him. So he knew why they were paying him more, because over 30 years, this guy was just given, regular increases. And so this guy knew this. So did the CEO. But my friend went back to the CEO and said, I appreciate the offer. I'm really excited about this additional responsibility. But the thing that bugs me is that you paid Hal more than you're paying me, which to me makes me feel like you don't respect me as much because you didn't respect Hal. So can you give me more money? Now, they all knew that he framed it. He didn't say, I know Hal's been here 30 years. And then the CEO would have been, exactly. I knew that that's why I'm not giving you as much money.
Right.
But he framed it. So it wasn't like he was being not honest. He wasn't giving information that he was holding himself, but he was just being thoughtful about how he framed it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I love that, and also what I hear in that is, and not in all negotiations, is the outcome what you're hoping for. I think
Exactly.
sometimes we and maybe in the American culture where we go to the store, pick the thing off the shelf and buy it, it's successful every time. In these kind of negotiations, I think you often have to set up and be ready for someone to say, yeah, but we're still not going to do it. And you go,
Mm-hmm.
okay. And to your point, and maybe even from a strengths perspective, thinking through the emotional impact, I'm going into this negotiation. If it's a no, how am I going to respond to that?
Mm-hmm.
Because we can burn that bridge down in a hurry. And we may need that bridge in the future, right? And to say, and to be as prepared for a yes as we are a no.
Yes.
And from a strengths perspective, to say, look, and I know I am quick to move on. And so in your 30-second, you talked about, hey, let's take 30 seconds to understand. I might need to tack that 30 seconds on to the end
Totally.
when if it's a no, okay, I'm going to give it 30 seconds before I say anything.
Yeah.
I'm just going to sit there and look, and I'm going to think about this for a second, because I know high adaptability, high activator, high arranger. I'm
Yeah.
already thinking through what I'm going to do next. And in 10 seconds, I may make a decision I regret. In 30 seconds, that may be a better decision, right? Thinking through that. I don't know. Does that stir
Totally.
any thoughts for you?
Oh my gosh. So right on point. And that would be the work for you, right? Is to say, what if they say no? Or what is my walk away? And then having a plan for that, so that in that moment you don't do something you regret. And you made me think too, also for a yes. If you go in and you expect this level, and they surprise you and they say, not only this, I'm going to give you, and you're so surprised by it, the worst thing you can do is just go, yep, where do I
Yep.
sign? And the reason is, obviously, your emotions are high. When your emotions are high, you're not thinking clear either. But it allows you to contemplate, let's ask for some more time. But it also keeps the ego intact for the other person. because when you signal, yes, let's sign right away, you've told them that you would have done it for a lot less. And that makes them feel bad. And you don't want that.
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
it's critical to think about, what does no look like? And what's my walk away? And what am I going to say? And always inserting silence. I think that's a best practice, is when you make an offer or you're given an offer, learn to awkward silence of counting to 10 slowly.
Mm-hmm.
And same for yes.
Yeah. Yeah. It's that's really hard for me. That's like I'm uncomfortable on the ask. And so as soon as they say yes or no, I'm like, good enough. Boom. Like out, like it's done. Instead of
Yes.
just waiting for a
Mhm.
moment and just be like, okay, let me think. It's awkward on the other side as well. Like
Mhm.
we say silence, it means making it awkward. That's what you're
Mhm.
doing, right? Because it's not, the other person on the other side of the table is not always prepared for that silence either. They haven't thought through this. We're coming in on approach. We have a few minutes. Lisa asked a good question, and I kind of want to wrap our discussion with this and get super practical. She said, when you work with a client, where do you start? Do you have a methodology that you use with your corporate clients? So I'm kind of thinking from a coaching perspective, if you were to give some great advice of, as you're helping, how do you do this? What's a real practical way that you could advise others maybe that are thinking about how to help their clients also with this area of influence?
Yeah. I think the first thing, as a best practice for all great coaches, is to really understand how they see themselves, and starting to see the evidence of how they appear within that corporate culture. Because often people that don't hold influence have a blind spot to why. And so part of understanding and helping them is to be able to see it from a lot of different angles. So, understanding it from them, and then asking those questions around how they have engagement, giving very specific examples, and then making them, or asking them to unveil um, what it looks like to them. Why is influence important to them? What's the goal they're trying to attain? Where are they trying to go within the company? And then starting to ask them about those relationships, and what do those interactions look like? Because I think that the key to influence is in the nuances of how they're engaging with others, and whether they're spending dwell time where they need to, and they're capitalizing on those right places. So I would have somebody do kind of a heat map around influence. Who are all the people in the organization that are important to them? Where do they fall in that? And who do they connect with? Who did they connect with? The 10 people they connected with in the last week. And if they're all just people that work for them, that's the first area. They should have arrows that go all over in the
Yeah.
organization, and those should be regular touch points.
And those might be informal and informal, right? And I think
Mhm.
this is an area where maybe the last 5 years things have changed a lot, where those influences or influencing may not be direct, and
Mm-mm.
so you've got to which brings in another level of how I negotiate through these situations and work through these people to get what the organization needs, or what I need for my organization, or what I need for me. And how am I going to do that in a situation where I don't maybe have direct responsibility, or I don't have a
Mhm.
direct line to them, and how I'm thinking of this piece of paper. We have a board of directors exercise where you put yourself in the middle and then you start saying, if I had my own personal board of directors, who would they be and why, right? I almost think of like that same exercise,
Yeah.
but from an influencing standpoint, who do I need to work with on a basis to get my job done? And maybe that backs all the way back up to what's expected of me in this
Mhm.
leadership role. What are the expectations the organization has for me? And then point those towards, okay, who's around me, and how are my themes and theirs going to influence those conversations that we're going to have on a regular basis? That sounds kind of fun. Maybe
That does.
doesn't
That's
it?
brilliant. Yeah, I think
Oh,
that's the
yeah,
key. Yeah.
yeah. Anything else you'd add to that? And as we wrap it up, as you're thinking, you've got a group, couple thousand certified coaches and coaches around the world listening to this. Final words of encouragement to them as you're thinking about both personally for them and then those they're coaching or influencing?
Yeah, I think it's not a one and done. I think that people, especially in the leadership role when they're moving toward executive, considering your influence within the organization is something that you have to make space for. And you really need to be thoughtful around because the shifting of the organizations are happening all the time. And especially as there's insecurity, those insecure times happen when there's downsizing and changes, and that being very aware of this in those times can really increase your chips in the influence game. And the thing I would tell coaches too, when you're running your business, don't be apprehensive about talking about the value you bring
Mm,
and really understanding that and honing that and getting really good practice at saying it. At the beginning of the conversation, we often don't want to talk about our value, but when you do it in a way that is expressing the value that the other party's going to get, it makes that getting the contract and getting all of those things set easier. So don't shy away from it.
little bonus content and a bonus question just for me as well as for the audience listening, and then we'll wrap this up. Doing a podcast episode is an exercise in influencing. It's my job to ask you great questions, keep it interesting. Like I'm negotiating with the audience of like, hey, are they engaged? This is why I have trouble doing a podcast without a chat room because I'm getting constant feedback. Are we doing so? Tell me how did I do? How did I do this morning as we were recording this in influencing this? Or what kind of advice would you have for me as a coach? And what could I have done better, or what did I do well? How about that? A little bonus content here at the end.
Yeah, I love this bonus question because it illustrates it so well. Is you were really intentional about this and understanding as you got further and further in podcasting about how important the influence of the audience and the connection. And you're so aware of you got to have the chat room because that is what really gives you that in the moment feedback. And so embracing that and bringing that to life, it became kind of invisible to you that
Mhm.
you're asking
Mhm.
for this to happen. So you've identified the conditions of this to make this you at your best, and asking for those ways, that in interaction, asking the question and having high standards. So being seeing this as a negotiation, I love that you brought this all
Mhm.
full circle because being able to use influence and use negotiation in our everyday then gives us those tools to go, this is how I can make this great
Mhm.
by thinking about those. So
Mm. Oh, thanks for that.
way to
Thanks
pull
for
it
that
all
feedback.
back.
Well, it's an interesting application because I
Yeah.
think again, sometimes we think about negotiating as just about buying and selling, and we do this every day in our relationships, in our with our partners, with our family, with our children.
Yeah.
Like negotiation in that sense, influencing is everywhere in this, and I think it's really really important to understand that I have an advantage. I've been doing this for 13 years now, and I kind of no, I'm comfortable with it, but it is always good to get feedback, even in these kind of settings. What I did for you would what we I would expect to do at the end of negotiation is to say, "Hey, by the way, did we get there?
Yeah.
Did we get everything that we needed?" Right? And it's a good. I think it's a good way to wrap it up. Sometimes we get so excited that we got a yes, or so disappointed we got a no, we forget to come back around and say, hey, give me a little feedback on that if you're willing to. Did
Mhm.
did we get there? What could have I have done differently? What could or because in some cases there's going to be a second shot at this, right? I think sometimes we think it's a one and done. Well, most negotiations in life are gonna come around again. That's why you don't burn that bridge down, right? You're
Totally.
like, okay, well, maybe not now. Maybe it's no, not now, right?
Yes.
And not a no, not ever. So I think there's some things to learn in that. Well, Susie, thanks for hanging out with me for an hour this morning. Always
So
appreciate it.
fun.
Like I said, you asked me, how long does this go? And I was like, almost always an hour. We just make it work that way. So thanks for coming out this morning to be a part of this. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. This was so fun. And thanks for all the questions in the chat room. That was super fun as well.
If folks had questions, what's the best way to contact you, just so that they might be, one, do you invite those kinds of interactions, and then how would they contact you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think the easiest way is just find me on LinkedIn. There's only one Susie Tomenchok, luckily for me.
Spell it for me for folks.
Tomenchok.
Perfect. Yeah. And get that done. Well, with that, we'll remind everyone to take full advantage of all the resources we do have available on Gallup Access. Head out to gallup.com/CliftonStrengths. Log in. There's search. There's all kinds of stuff for you there. If you're interested in coaching, master coaching, or if you want to become a Gallup-Certified Strengths Coach, like we've talked about, like Susie is, you can contact us. Send us an email, coaching@gallup.com. For future webcasts, and I'll get busy on those here as of this recording. There's not a lot out there, but head out to gallup.eventbrite.com. When I get back from a much needed vacation, we'll get some more scheduled in there, and follow us there for all the details. Find us on any social group by searching Clifton Strengths. And big thanks to the chat room today. You guys were a big part of the influence of this episode, and so thanks for being there. We'll do this all again next time. For those listening live, with that, we'll say goodbye, everybody.